Welcome everybody to another Kraken Cast podcast where we talk to content creators, creative directors, artists, videographers, and everybody in between. We are continuing on with our series talking to Elder Scrolls Online streamers and content creators. Today we're going to be joined by Nefas. Nefas is not only a partner streamer on Twitch, part of the ESO stream team, also heads up the ESO University, creates a lot of wonderful videos on YouTube, and is the father of some gorgeous ferrets. So without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome to the podcast, Nefas.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. How are you? How's your day going?
Well. Going great. Just kind of starting out. I always like to kind of find out people's journeys. Everybody's journey to hitting the going live button is a little bit different. Everybody has different reasons why they decided to give streaming a chance, from curiosity to having like big aspirations and ambitions. I'm curious, what made you decide to just get into streaming content creation in general?
Oh man, that's a long story. So I guess it started when back then, years ago, no one really knew what they were doing. And then out of all that chaos, there were really awesome content creators like Deltia, Lefty Lucy, and a few others people probably don't know about anymore. And I got a lot of inspiration from not just those people, but also Outcast and Woler. And they're probably the two I respect them the most out of all the content creators, because they paved the way for essentially not just anyone to do content creation, but specifically for endgame players to do content creation. They showed us that, hey, it's possible, that, hey, people are interested in actually what we do. So I looked at that and I was like, well, I can try, or I will try. Obviously, the people around me at the time, they weren't very supportive or didn't understand what I had in mind, because to a lot of people, I think content creation or just streaming in general is viewed as not challenging in the sense that it's hard, which I think is a misconception in itself, but I think it's also that you either need to have some sort of viral moment, or you need some sort of big breakthrough, or you're just kind of one fish in this huge ocean that no one will ever find. So not a lot of people think it's risky for good reason, and it kind of is. And so I didn't have the support, but I did anyway. And at the time, Delty actually quit the game, or rather content creation. And I remember this video he made. I still watch it sometimes for some inspiration. And in this video, he said, hey, I'm quitting ESO, I'm quitting content creation, I just want to play games now instead of just making videos and focusing on the website. And then he said, but for those of you who want to get into content creation, try it for 1 year. And I was like, okay, I'll try it for 1 year. And that was probably the best advice I've taken, because he said, after 1 year, let's see if you like it, let's see if you're successful, let's see if it's making any headway. And I did it for a year. And I based it off of teaching. Like, back then, we used to teach each other quite a bit in the guilds and in teams. We teach each other how to get to 20k DPS or 30k DPS. And I just started from that point. How do I simplify things to the point where people can learn or process doing things? And that just led to a whole lot of things. But yeah, I gave it a year. After a year, I got to like maybe 4,000 YouTube subs, which isn't, in the grand scheme of things, much. Twitch, no one was really watching me on Twitch. I think it was like average of 4 or 5 viewers, because no one except like maybe other raiders knew me. And then it just kind of continued. I was like, okay, the first year's not that bad, but not that great, and I'll try to keep going, because I do have a passion for it. And I kept going, and then I started seriously doing things in 2019, so a little over 2 years ago at this point. And at that point, it just started exponentially booming, and I just stuck with it ever since. And that's pretty much a story of my journey to content creation.
That's
just
awesome.
Trying it and having a passion for it and seeing where it went.
That's awesome.
I'm still seeing where it goes.
Every day, still figure out where things go. That's really for sure. And you mentioned a lot of things there, and so I'm going to kind of go back and touch on a few things throughout that.
I can't hear you if you're talking.
Oh, Let me see.
I think you're muted in Discord. I see a mute mic.
Oh, I got muted in Discord. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I accidentally clicked my toggle the mute button. All right.
No problem.
So yeah, that was really awesome. Thank you for kind of outlining that whole journey. You actually brought up a number of things there I think are really like interesting, and that I'd kind of like to go back and touch on just a few of those.
Sure.
One of those things is obviously how much timing can be everything, and looking kind of at your Twitch stats and stuff using things like Twitch Tracker. You started all the way back in 2017. Like I said, it was a lot of learning as you went and having kind of like lower viewership for quite a while back then. Obviously, Twitch is still not majorly known, but it's a much more known entity, especially with COVID now. So I think it's really interesting to hear about those journeys that went through kind of Twitch's more like transformative stage. Because even if you look at Elder Scrolls, like the viewership even of the game itself, quite little, and started going up. So you kind of grew in a lot of ways, at least with your Elder Scrolls content along with it, which I think gives a really amazing perspective to things.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And the other thing about that is, one of the things I always like to talk about is, for lack of a better term, your content should provide value. It can be entertainment, it can be education, it can be all sorts of things. You mentioned about wanting to provide educational content. Obviously, along those lines, I kind of want to talk about, like you talked about, getting to 4,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is, while it's not huge in the grand scheme of things, it is also not small. It's not easy to get past that first 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 hump on YouTube. And I want to talk about how creating educational content, stuff that comes out of guilds and stuff, that led to Elder Scrolls, the ESOU, which, if you don't know, there's a website that has not just Nefas, but other creators that brought on, that put up articles and things like that in that educational nature. There's a full Discord for that. What kind of led you to create like ESOU and kind of cultivate that?
Oh man, that's also another long story.
It's fine. I figured it would be.
Okay. It's ESOU is pretty interesting. It wasn't exactly planned, but I would say, looking back, it's like a culmination of I guess not just my experiences as a player or a creator, but also the culmination of all the experiences that this really small endgame community is so went through. Because years ago, well, back in the day, there wasn't. It's kind of like how PvP is right now in ESO. There's no real semblance or feeling of community as far as I would say PvP goes, and maybe that's debatable, but I'd say that's pretty true for the most part. But back then, PvE was quite, in terms of at least the raiding community, quite split. It wasn't a community; it was just little pockets of players or groups or teams, and there was a lot of drama back then. Quite a bit of toxicity even at the highest level, and of course along the way to the highest level, there's a lot of toxicity you encounter, or very unpleasant characters you encounter on the way to endgame, or what you think is the endgame. So, and when I was starting as a content creator, I was like, how every content creator has some sort of personality cult based around them. It's in the name too. Like, look at, I'm not calling anyone out specifically, but look at Dots Gaming, Outcast HQ, Loctavian. You base it around yourself. The community is centered on the creator more so than the idea or concept of something. And I was going to do the same thing. I made a Discord server for myself, and but I started thinking like what's that gonna really do? And then the friend of mine at Sona, he approached me and we started talking about things about teaching people. And I was like, well, I can teach people through videos and stuff. But then I realized at the time there was no community. It's really hard to grab attention for the content you like doing. To grab the attention of not just players, but also developers. Just look at PvP, right? So I didn't want that. I didn't want that to happen to rating. I didn't want that to happen to people I knew or PvEers. And then we just figured, okay, what if there was a Discord server where we brought everybody in, doesn't matter who you are, and all the in-game players, all the score pushers, all these supposedly toxic people, taught everybody, no matter who you are. The information's free. It's all transparent. There's no need to pay. I know creators used to have like private lessons, or they still do. Like you pay $100 for someone to tutor you one-on-one whether it's FPS or even ESO. Gilliam did it, I think. Deltia did it. Cypher, everybody. But I didn't want that. We didn't want that because we don't really believe in this idea of a pay gate or paying for information or paying for learning. It's a game. You're supposed to enjoy it, and the information should already be readily accessible for you to use. Everything beyond that, whatever. If you want to pay somebody or help donate to a creator for them to actually spend time with it, yeah, go for it. But outside of that, actual information that you may need, we just want to provide a place for that. Because going back to what I said about experiences, a lot of people criticize me these days for maybe not understanding or being out of touch with the newer players or casual players, which I don't think is true, because the way I started rating, or seriously rating, was, I vividly remember this because it was so messed up. I was relatively new to rating, and my social guild and I were doing veteran segment video. And obviously, at the time, no one knew what we were doing. But this one guy knew. He brought in his friend who knew the trial and how to clear the trial, and we were going through all of it. And he just started acting really condescending, and it just felt bad. It just felt bad. And after that experience, I was like, man, I don't want to be talked down to like that ever again. I don't like that, and that's how I got more into rating, because I just wanted to not depend on anybody or be at the mercy of some idiot or some
and being talked
person.
down to, like you described, is a form of gatekeeping. And I think the thing you do with freedom of information, getting the information out there, having the server for ESOU and stuff like that is extremely important, and for a lot of the reasons you mentioned. But just in general, like, I think one of the things that can harm a community more than anything is honestly that gatekeeping, that this content's really hard, I'm going to talk down to you, you have to do it my way, there's no other way to learn. Like, and providing services like you do, and creators who provide those services, I think is super important. And it goes for more things. Obviously, as ESU has grown, you brought on people like Ari who do like stuff with housing and stuff, because housing's another thing that, well, it's not that hard content you do, is still something that can be intimidating. I think the more things that are provided lets people enjoy the game and work their way up to that content. Just a kind of a little anecdote. I paid for a carry once, not a carry so I could get the clear in a veteran dungeon, but back when I was newer on PlayStation, we were trying to figure out the trial and stuff like that. We weren't finding as much information about how to do the veteran trial. So I literally, there was guilds offering and go, and I didn't pay cash, but I paid a quantifiably large amount of gold so that they would take the time and explain everything to me, so I could take that knowledge and bring it back to my guild so we could do it, because there wasn't as much information I could find out there back at that time about how to do the trials, which nowadays I could go to ESOU, I could look up videos and stuff like that, and I could get that information and bring it back without having to go track down somebody who needs 25 million gold just to show me the ropes, so I have that information.
Right. Well, that sucks you have to do that.
I didn't know what I was doing, so I nowadays I probably would have looked a little harder, but I do think that what you provide is really an amazing service. I'm just kind of carrying along of those same kind of lines as far as like creating more of a community space versus a personal space. Because like, I mean, I have a personal Discord. It seems like every content creator has a personal Discord versus one that has a focus.
I recently made one too, because I was like, well, I want to keep myself separate. I don't want it to be about, and I really don't like this too. Like, you know how some people get when they're put in a position of power, whether it's stupid like a Discord rule. I really hate arguments from authority, and I just, you know what I mean? Like, I just want to separate that from myself. Like, just because I own the server, whatever, doesn't mean you should never agree with me or feel the need to always agree with me. You should always feel the need to contest me. You should always feel the need to disprove me, and I would welcome it. I think that should be the attitude of everybody who's teaching there, because the people who teach there can also learn from people. But oftentimes, because of something superficial like a Discord role or something like that, or a position people may perceive you to be in, people act really weird and off-putting. And I think you raise a great point about gatekeeping and within the definition of being condescending to people. And that was another big thing back then. There was a lot of that, and you can't grow a community, or you can't really grow an interest in what that community is doing if you're gonna be mean to people or be aggressive at all. And that's also what was one of the goals of ESOU. Hey, to show that, hey, you know, all this talk, and they talk about this still to this day, a lot of them, you know, all this talk about us being toxic or whatever. I mean, that's not true. Here's the evidence. And that's one thing too that we wanted ESOU to be.
Yeah, and that's just kind of where I was going with it about the uniqueness, because I only recently got on the server, but I was obviously poking around because I had been on the website but not on the server, and it's kind of that separation. And I mean, if we go back as far as like ancient Western philosophers, they would get together and they would share the information they had, and like you said, debate, disproving, and back and forth is actually how you increase knowledge and education. I think it's really
right.
I wanted to bring up how you do have that separation, because it can be to some creators tempting, or because it's your server to like kind of use something like ESOU or a server like that that's supposed to be a group thing as your own like personal repository for your own content creation, whereas your content creation, everything obviously adds to all that, but you keep it a space that is like kind of free flowing for information without gatekeeping, which I think is tremendous. I'll put links to that for those of you. I put links in the chat for anybody who's watching this on YouTube or listening. There will be links to the ESOU Discord and website in the description. So going back to kind of ESO, not as much content creation, but we'll lead into that because obviously it has a lot to do with the content you create. Obviously, there's so many things to do in the game, from housing and questing and trials, but also the veteran hard mode trifecta trial stuff. What really led you to like the hardest content in the game, to want to like make that like such a cornerstone of what you enjoy about the game and what you like create content around?
Oh, you're asking such good questions, but also it's gonna be long stories again. So I apologize. No
need to apologize. This is all about getting that information out there. We're all about story time here.
Okay, sure, that's great. So how it happened was I was originally mainly a PvPer, and I played this game since beta, and I've never taken a break from playing the game. Like you said, there's so much to do in the game, and people usually quit or get burnt out because they only do one thing in the game, whether it's PvP, PvE, or whatever. But back then I was originally a PvPer, and I ended up meeting, and we were also, I also managed a social guild back then, and we were all basically a second family, like legitimately. When people say second family, they you know, but we were actually a family. We would always hang out, we'd talk about life, we'd send each other gifts, and you know, actual family. And through that family, I met this group of friends who joined us, and I ended up PvPing with them quite a bit. And one of them, Pale, we PvP'd quite a lot together frequently. We had a lot of fun. And then one day he was like, you know, after this was after a night of Imperial City PvP, which was very different back then. You know, there's a new trial out. And I want to try doing it. And it was Maw Lorcage. It was 2016. And he said, and I was like, okay, let's try it. And then he said, okay, well, let's get this group together for normal Maw Lorcage, because the prevailing thought amongst a lot of players back then was, which may seem a little silly now, is that if you can do normal really well, you can probably be prepared for veteran mode. So his plan was, okay, let's do normal. And then, first few raid nights, we were like, okay, well, we know that's normal, Maul. And he's like, I think we're ready for vet. And then he said, oh, well, I gotta take a break. And didn't really hear from him for a couple weeks. And then turns out he kind of, I don't want to say lied. He kind of didn't say it or didn't say anything, but he was undergoing surgery, and he had complications from that, and then he died. And that group of friends, we were also broken up about it, and I think they still have that like video of us doing that in-game memorial. And man, I could barely speak, and I was pretty ashamed of that, because I could they had people talk about them. I can so at that point I didn't want to do trials. But then, as time went by, PvP just kind of declined in terms of the quality for me. So I was like, okay, well, let's try trials again. And that's when I started getting into as many groups as I could. At one point, I was raiding 28 hours a week, just with different groups throughout the entire week, trying to learn and absorb as much information as I could. And I was very eager to do so, because the incident that I mentioned to you before happened sometime after Pale died, and I just never wanted to depend on somebody ever again, or be at the mercy of somebody. And so I did that. And eventually, I was like, okay, I'm looking for a vet Mob Lord College trial group, and there weren't many back then. The only two raid teams on PCNA at the time that cleared Mob Lord College was first Crown Store Heroes, and then after that there was some drama with that. After that was Order of Mundus, and then after that was Epic Synergy. And then at the time you could do a veteran trial, and you could sell things from veteran trials. So if you did Hellraw Citadel, you could get a golden necklace of the sun, and then take that out of the trial and sell this to people. And that got a lot of people into raiding. Even PvPers started doing trials. And there was this group of PvPers who liked doing trials so much together that they stayed in PvE for the most part. And I eventually joined that group. And we started doing harder content, or at least hard content for us. We did VMall. Then we started going for VMall hard mode. Then we became the third guild on PCNA to clear the VMall hard mode, and that group eventually became mechanically challenged. And I don't think anyone even knows about that group anymore. But yeah, so at that point we started getting more competitive, and I think I'm a naturally competitive person. So I just got really into the hard modes. I really got into score pushing, which is an entirely different story from just clearing hard mode. And I fell in love with how open it is. And it might sound weird to a lot of people, because when people think endgame or meta or score pushing, they think it's very constricted. It's very narrow field. You can only do so many sets. You can only do so many ideas. But it's the opposite, actually. When you're score pushing, you try everything. You do anything. See if anything works consistently. See if anything is actually better. It's always experimenting, always testing. And I fell in love with it. And then that's when I started focusing my content on not just teaching people how to do 30k, 40k DPS, but on how to do trials, on how to recognize mechanics, on how to raid lead, on how to theory craft raid compositions. And ever since then, I've been doing that.
Amazing. First off, even if it was a while back, sorry for your loss. I definitely know how loss can kind of reshape and contextualize how things are approached. And it goes off what you're saying, like people you raid with and do content with and are in guilds with, you become like family. So
yeah.
And then kind of on the going off of that, so I've never streamed it, but I have a background in speed running. And I bring that up because speed running is about doing every little thing, finding every little thing to just shave seconds off. Whereas while I've never been into the score pushing, I've watched people who are into score pushing. It seems like a lot of the same, where it's like you can't just do what's tried and true, because you're trying to do every little thing you can do to eke out just a little more points, get a little further ahead, do a little more better. So I feel like there's the competitive nature of that, of just wanting to keep pushing for that higher and higher score, or shaving time off in the case of speed running. I can definitely understand that. And I think that's a aspect of the game not many people, like I said, if you look at the percentage of the people who different content really fully get into, so I think it's really interesting. But the reason I bring it up though is I want to link it back to a tweet you made just maybe a week or so back. Made a tweet that says something everyone in the ESO fam actually agrees on. I have way too many new ESO players ask me questions they shouldn't be, or tell me they just want to grind. You're going to burn out. Just enjoy the game. And it has forums, in-game players, casual players, has the swords and memes on it, right? Don't min-max your power levels as a new player. Enjoy the game. The reason I bring that up is I feel like, so I'm probably one of the streamers on Twitch who's the most, I'm not anti-meta in terms of like what does well, but I'm anti, like, people are like, what every little last thing do I have to do? So even I'm like, unless you're looking at this like small percentage and you want to go towards that, like there's so much you can do. So many things are actually perfectly viable. And it kind of gets to the point where I feel like there's people who look at like top end stuff, look at sets or look at builds and go, this is the only way to do this or do that. I'm just curious your thoughts on, like, as somebody who put out like a tweet about, like, as a new player, you don't need to be worrying about like grinding and min-maxing, like kind of more your thoughts on like kind of the culture as the game's growing towards more and more people feeling like they have to min-max, have to grind, everything has to be meta, and that's the only way, especially coming from that score pushing side and making build guides and theory crafting where you are actually trying new things.
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to this. I think the first thing that people will be surprised to know is there's a lot more we share in common between endgame and casual or newer players. There's a lot of areas where we intersect, actually, in terms of trying everything out, thinking for yourself, and a lot of things. And people will expect me to say otherwise, but I hate this idea that as any player, you just need to think about min-maxing. You need to power level, you know what I mean? It's ridiculous. And you said you were describing yourself as not anti-meta, but I think you're trying to find a word for it of some kind. I think in both of our cases, I think we're just, I think a proper description would be like, oh God, this is a tough one. Not like anti-conformist, not like anti-sheep or something like that, but like,
I'm kind of anti-conformist. So a little bit of it is my personality. That's like, don't you tell me how to play, but
pro thinking, I think. People don't think about things. They just look at something, they want to simplify as much as they want, so they say this is best, or this is bad, or this is whatever. But that's really not the case, and that's where the culture of things going that way. I don't think it's going that way. I think that culture has always kind of been there as far as gaming goes, or even like as life goes. You just want to make it so simple to the point that it's not true, but objectively not true, but it's true for you. So yeah, I don't agree with the things that people often say, and it's not just me, it's also pretty much everyone I know has that same opinion. Like that meme you mentioned, don't min-max your power, you're gonna burn out. No one I know has ever told a new player, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to grind, you need to go there, you need to do that, you need to do this in order, you just ignore questing. No one's ever said that. I know not a single person who said that. But the people who do say that are usually not even like the best players, which is ironic considering.
for my experience, that this is not just ESO, but in life, it is almost never the people who are sitting at the top doing that. Like even in other MMOs I played, like I was a vanilla WoW raider, pushing like server first and world third on Sethune and stuff like that back in my WoW days. Nobody who was sitting at that level was ever preaching that down to people, and nobody who's just starting out was. It's some middle ground line where it's like, if I just copy this build, then this is the easiest way to do it. I feel like preaches it in the middle. I think that's where that kind of comes from, because like you said, nobody like that you're running with, nobody who's doing that top stuff is saying this is the only way to do it, but it kind of gets in people's heads. I always bring it up. I think part of the non-conformist or the pushing back also comes from on console. Before I moved to PC, I was a Stamblade, so I've gone through enough years of that is meta. Khajiit Stamblade is the best that's ever been, you can always come along onto the, oh, you don't do Mage DPS.
Yeah.
We don't really want you to come on. Like I have seen the like ups and downs and cycles of stuff. So it's always interesting. I always want to put it out there because I think most people agree with the post you made. I thought it was good to post. I was like, nobody's saying don't do this content and try not to burn yourself out like trying to min-max a power level, because it's a lot about learning. Even if you follow somebody's build guide, because I'm somebody who starts from people's builds, and then as I play, I go, I know my style, so I'll change abilities and change things up. So I just think it's important to talk about that because it's there's this kind of in between place where people think there's only one way to do things, and it's really not always the case. And it's especially if you're doing normal, like that's the thing, especially if you're also like, I think where I see it the most is people are trying to get together like normal trial groups, and they're like trying to push these like min-max things. I'm like, normal trials are a whole different beast from a veteran trial. You can kind of get through that with almost any composition of people. I think I was on one of your streams the other day where you were talking about, I think I came in the middle of it, but I think you were having a discussion about whether or not like a trial finder would be a good thing or not for the game.
Oh yeah, that was talking about the concept of roles in ESO.
Yeah, roles. That's right.
Mostly, and how I believe that there shouldn't be role designation in normal, as far as normal content goes, or even vet, to a degree. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, how people think there's one way to do it, or there's one single element of something to do with a specific thing, activity or group. But I gave the example. For example, recently there's some VA's hard mode groups, and my example was, okay, so what does a tank do? And someone in chat said, who was disagreeing with me, by the way, they said, oh, a tank needs to keep aggro. Okay. And they said, oh, they need to keep aggro. They need to, take the damage. And then I said, okay, well, what do you call a tank in VA's hard mode who's holding the aggro but doing damage? Like actual damage. They're not just holding block. They're not just sitting there. They're doing damage. They're in like medium armor. They have no sword and board. They just have they just have weapon. You know what I mean? So what do you call that? Do you call that a tank or a DPS? So I think people. It's ironic because it's the same people who say play how you want, but they often also try to limit how you play, which is, I don't know what's up with that, but going along with the ESO's philosophy of play how you want, I support it wholeheartedly. You do whatever you want, try anything you want. So I really don't understand where these people are getting this idea from, that you need to do it one way or another, or that you can't do stam, you have to do mag, or you can't do mag, you have to do stam.
My theory has always come from just for the longest time, at least if we're going to look at like MMOs, there's MMOs before, there's EverQuest, Ultima Online and stuff, and plenty after, but WoW sat king of the mountain for so long that I think people got so ingrained with this concept of, you have a tank does this, you have a healer does this, you have DPS, they do this, because coming from a WoW rating background, there definitely is not the flexibility that we have in ESO with it. At least there wasn't back in early days of WoW. So I think that might be part of it, just that mindset. But something you brought up there, I think is because like people talk about fake tanks, or people not tanking correctly and things like that. And I think I always say that more important than anything is synergy, which is when you're working with your group. Like if somebody's doing something one way, compensating for it by like filling it, like if the tank is tanking by doing damage and it's light, or maybe even kiting a bit more, being able to adapt and, okay, we're going to fight this boss this way, because there is plenty of bosses, at least in dungeons, in veteran hard mode dungeons, been able to take out by like, we're not doing it by the standard tried and true tactics, but we can synergize and work around it. I also say that because when I moved to PC, I decided I want to be a healer, but because I am contrarian a bit, I was like, I'm going to be a Nightblade healer, and that's a whole different it's a whole different world, because most people are like, you need to be a warden or a Templar because of this. I'm like, I can make this work. I mean, it's a bit different. Yes, I'm doing more damage. Yes, I'm built more around critting off this and that, but I'm going to make this work if nothing else.
I mean, you don't have to make it where it works.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And people have really short memories too. I mean, Nightblade healing was very optimal in the highest end game content or like the level. So I mean, you can do it on any class. It's just people just so small minded. Yeah, and going back to about, you know, what is it? You said fake tank game or like whatever. It's funny because I've heard more stories from people who were actual tanks and new players, by the way, that were called fake tanks. So I don't know. It's funny.
Yeah, it's interesting because like as long as you can do the content, like things are viable. Like
I think a large part of it just stems from the fact people have expectations for strangers. You know,
yeah,
I don't think you should have any expectations when you're pugging.
That's true.
None at all.
Yeah, a pug is a pug, and that's the thing. It's like I try to preach when people talk to me about it, and I practice what I preach as far as courtesy. If I go into a dungeon, I see somebody's kind of like lower level or lower CP, I always go, hey, do you need to do the quest or something like that? Do you need me to explain it? But you can't even have that expectation of people. But because yeah, when you're in a pug, it's just, you know, you get what you get, and you got to go with it.
Yeah, pretty much.
To kind of move back a little bit towards content creation and things like that, I wanted to talk a little bit about, like you said, you started in 2017, and you know you had growth here and there, and like I said, looking at, you know, what went up to about 2025, and then like you said, when you really started applying yourself stuff from like into 2019 through 2020, that's when you really started like kind of like coming up. But since you've been like, since you've kind of like come up, got to that like partner level and things like that, you've had a lot of ups and downs, like we all do as streamers. I was curious if you could talk to that. That's something I always like to talk about on the podcast as far as like viewership, because a lot of people, when they first experience the raise, even if it's just up 10 people, up 100 people, doesn't matter how many people it's up, then they have that first dip or they plateau out. It can cause a lot of like mental strife. So I always like to talk to people who've been, you know, gone through a lot of highs, lows, and plateaus because they've streamed for a long time, to talk about that and kind of share that with people.
Okay. Viewership. As far as Twitch goes, I don't really care if I have 5 viewers or 500 viewers.
Fair.
It doesn't bother me. Like, I can go up one day and I'll be, oh, that's pretty cool. You can go down. I'm like, oh, I'm still streaming, so I don't care. I think a lot of people place too much of their mental health and emotional investment in numbers. And sure, yes, I see this on streamer Twitter all the time. I'm sure you see it too. All these people like supporting each other in these ways. They say like, oh, you know, it's just numbers. Well, the numbers actually do matter, but like I feel like they should be saying, well, there's always so much more potential to grow. I hate it when people say, oh, you know, whatever, don't worry about it, it's just numbers. But I think at the same time, you shouldn't place too much investment into those numbers. As far as Twitch goes, I think where the numbers are actually concerned right now, that people should be concerned about if they are a content creator, is YouTube, not Twitch. I don't care how, and you know, people also celebrate, oh, I got to 5,000 followers or 10,000 followers on Twitch or something like that. I'm like happy for them. At the same time, like, well, okay, and you know, I don't say anything, but okay, and because when you go stream, not all 10,000 ever really watch, right? So that doesn't matter. But when YouTube for YouTube, it actually does matter how many subscribers you have and how many people engage with your videos. It doesn't really matter for Twitch because Twitch doesn't have any real discoverability. Actually has a lot of discoverability issues. Doesn't matter how many viewers you have, doesn't matter how many followers you have when you're streaming or what time you're streaming, unlike YouTube where everything has an algorithm. So as far as Twitch goes, I don't really care. YouTube, sure, I'll care a bit more.
Right. And I think that's something you brought up right there that's really important about numbers, is telling people just turn off your viewer count and don't worry about numbers is very short-sighted. I have a background before I started streaming in brand and reputation development for burgeoning tech companies, which means I'm all about analytics. I'm all about numbers. While it's true you shouldn't be concerned about numbers, because yeah, sometimes your numbers can go down, especially if you tie yourself to one game. Your numbers every ESO streamer is probably down right now because this is year over year. This is where ESO is at its lowest player base too. It's always right after kind of the last chapter DLC, but before people get real hyped again because they announced the next chapter. Like that's just how it goes. But I think the reason I like to bring up numbers is because on a long enough timeline, you do have those ups and downs. So not worrying about it where you let it completely destroy your mental health because, oh, I was down, but also like not completely ignoring that, like they are numbers and there's something to like keep an eye on. They help you like maybe guide your content or things like that. But I think there's some in between streamer Twitter and don't worry at all about your numbers. And you know, don't judge yourself and don't judge your content. Don't judge your creativity. Don't limit yourself creatively based on your numbers. But it is okay to use your trends to kind of dictate, oh, when I do this stuff, this is on a, if I look at 90 days, okay, that's good. People like that. And the other thing you brought up though is the kind of the reason I'm bringing up is a good segue to mental health because I feel like that's what mentally taxes people. And you recently made a very kind of public post about your own mental health, and I think I think as streamers, as content creators, as people who are more in the public eye, but even if you're just like a guild leader, anything that has a lot of people that are coming to you look at, it's a really kind of difficult thing to talk about, especially when you have people that are like wanting to call you toxic and thing. I'm just curious what kind of maybe like, I don't have to get any more into the weeds with it, or I don't want to make it like an uncomfortable thing, but what made you make that decision to kind of be like, come out and make that kind of twit longer and be like, here's me, here's my mental health, and like make that kind of a public thing? Because that's kind of it's a brave thing, but it's also a very scary thing to kind of put yourself out there in that kind of vulnerable position like that.
I don't think it's brave. I think the fact that it took me so long, and this was a process too, like it's been about 10 years since I was since I was diagnosed, and even before that I probably had inklings of it or some semblance of an illness. But what made me come out recently, it was just I debated like a lot. You know, I confided in maybe a couple people, and I would always have these debates with them, and also with myself as to should I come out or not, or tell people or be open about it. And it kind of changed over the years because 10 years ago it was really unthinkable. I mean, even a bit more than 10 years, it was really unthinkable for someone to come out as gay, or someone to come out as an atheist, or whatever minority. And that's more amplified with me because I'm a first generation immigrant. And in that community, it's not wise to throw away those community ties if you come out as, for example, like I was heavily Christian, but then I I completely broke away, and that cost me a lot. Not in terms of money, but in terms of social relations and communal support, because back then, again, it was unthinkable for you to not be Christian, at least within that community or even in the general public. And it was even worse if you were something else, like if you were gay or mentally ill. There was a poll back then where the most discriminating groups in America were basically atheists and the mentally ill and the gay community. And I happen to be in two of those groups, and I'm also a minority too. So it was scary back then. I couldn't really be publicly expressive. As time went on, it got better. I think it got better. And it just kind of made me think about, oh, should I also kind of be public about it? But I didn't, because at that point I went abroad. I was pretty fortunate in this, because I actually managed to graduate early from high school many years ago. And then instead of going directly to college or something like that, I went abroad and went everywhere in Asia and did a lot of things. And after years of doing that, I found out I was actually quite sick. And I was fortunate in that because there's a thing called medical tourism where people from America actually go overseas to get cheaper medicine or cheaper consultation. But also another thing that they don't talk about with medical tourism is the anonymity of doing so. There's no records if you go to a hospital in Hong Kong, or there's no records if you go to Thailand or something like that, right? So I did that. I took advantage of that, and it took me a while. There were a lot of things, and I don't want to make viewers uncomfortable.
Yeah, sorry, I know that's more difficult. All right, so before we were interrupted, we were talking about kind of your mental health and kind of your journey with coming out about that, the kind of the difficulties, you know, of, you know, being able to come out about it, because obviously bringing up things like you mentioned, like being an religion, sexuality, ethnicity, mental health are really difficult subjects.
Yeah, they can't, or I don't think they're difficult. I think it's
polarizing, I guess, is a better word, because for some people they can be
polarizing or awkward because it's not often talked about much, or it's just something you don't expect to talk about. I feel like I was actually just telling Chad about me visiting a friend's classroom. She was teaching, and the subject of, you know, they were analyzing a play or something, and then she brought up, you know, have you ever felt the need to kill yourself? Can you relate to these characters? And the room was very quiet. The room was very quiet. No one said anything. So yeah, I don't think really, even if people have these issues, they don't expect to talk about them, or maybe not be able to understand them. But yeah, like I was saying earlier, I didn't want to make people uncomfortable, but there were a lot of things that happened overseas. I got diagnosed. Initially, it was diagnosed as bipolar disorder, which then turned into, over time, I don't know, like schizoaffective disorder. I started having panic attacks, but then there was this one particularly bad episode where I almost, or did, I don't even know how to describe it. That's also a long story. And then after that incident, I started having, and I still do because I'm not on meds, and that might scare some people. But you know, I started becoming psychotic, or being in psychosis. Sorry, and I would just I have visual and auditory hallucinations, which makes things quite difficult. And I had to actually relearn a lot of things, and act in some normal capacity what I didn't have trouble before with. For example, paying attention to somebody or making eye contact when there's so many things going on. It's quite, I had to get acclimated to that. If things got too bad, and you know, I think I mentioned it in that post. Like, I'm really thankful I live in such an age of technology where we have phones, and you know, if something, you know what I mean, like, it just makes things a lot easier to disguise. And I kept that up for 7 years. And throughout those 7 years since that incident, I talked with a couple people and debated with them the morality of it. Do you come out? And I say come out because I took a lot of inspiration from looking at how the LGBT community was doing it. You know what I mean? I mean, again, it was back during this time, it was unthinkable for people to be gay in a lot of social circles or public areas. But then when people started doing that, more people started coming out. So I debated this morality. Like, do I come out? Does that help somebody? Should I care about that somebody? And throughout the years, I met people, and I didn't even tell them, like when they were confiding in me, oh, I'm suicidal or I'm mentally ill, something like that. And I would comfort them, but not as somebody who shared that. And I so desperately wanted to, but at the same time, I didn't want to, because overseas and even within the States, I don't know how true it is nowadays, but years ago, again, it wasn't just societal discrimination of mentally ill people, but it was also like financial and healthcare discriminations. I ended up in basically a mental asylum at one point overseas. And what they do is they basically, like, if they don't have room in jail or in prison, temporary holding areas, they put the criminals in there with with patients. And I've also heard stories from other people in the States, similar things. There's like there's a lot of abuse, and I saw that too. And it's like, well, if that's how if that's how they treat you, then why would you risk it?
As a content creator who is queer but also has severe ADHD and other mental health things that I share, I definitely understand that there's a lot of years, and it is coming out with is the same with, not the same, but it's very similar with both, because it is putting yourself out there, and yeah, like you said, ending up in mental health care facilities and not being able to get out, like things like that are very, very scary realities, especially the further back you go with less and less understanding about mental health, which is only currently making any really strides in a lot of mental health areas. So I definitely understand, because these are things that I'm very out with as a streamer, but it took me a lot of years myself also to get there and be like, okay, I do want to put this out there so other people going through it know that I do have that understanding as somebody who also has these mental conditions and things.
Yeah. But yeah, I saw a lot of stuff, and there's things like no plumbing, just medicinal abuse, just lack of care, really. People hate you for the color of your skin or whatever. Just imagine, just being different like that, and I just couldn't do it. So, but then, recently, within the past year and a half, my psychosis has been getting stronger in a lot of ways, and I don't think I can really act as well as I used to. So I figured, well, and compounded by the fact that I did have a couple friends kill themselves too within the past 2-3 years, and that also kind of tore me up too, because what if I had told them, maybe they would have had somebody.
Yeah. Well,
so yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing all that. I know it's a bit of a difficult thing, but since I do have such a focus on mental health, I always like to talk about mental health when people are willing to. So appreciate you being willing to be open about that and share that, because I know it's a more difficult subject, I feel like, to talk about, that's not as often talked about, but it's important also to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know where to go from there, but that's yeah, right. It's insane. I don't, people have asked me recently, well, why aren't you on meds? And I'm like,
there's a whole thing for anybody who has any form of mental health related things, no matter what it is. There's a whole thing with how meds affect you, and that's a whole. I could dedicate a number of podcasts to just talking
we
about,
could talk about hours,
and hours, because it's mental health. Unfortunately, is not like having the flu. You can't just take a medicine and be like, okay, I'll get through this. So there's a whole dichotomy to whether or not meds are the right choice and things like that, for sure.
Yeah.
Just to kind of move things back a little bit towards content creation, I really appreciate you sharing that as we kind of move towards the end. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, obviously, over 4,500 hours just streamed at Elder Scrolls. It's the main thing that you stream and things like that. But over the years, and especially recently, notice been branching out. If you look at like Twitch trackers, so you can see like hours in like Back for Blood and Apex Legends, Halo. Been doing Age of Empires recently, just because I think there's a couple thoughts on content creation. Some people grow in variety and it's a lot harder to grow, but then they have people that follow them anywhere. And then there's people like myself or like you who kind of grew mostly in one game. And then, you know, we play other games, we want to branch out. So just, I think content creators get really kind of like numbers, get scared of change, get scared of not of creatively pushing themselves and get scared of maybe trying other things. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on what kind of led to you like spending more time in, you know, it's not the primary thing you do, but you do spend time in just chatting in Age of Empires, in Halo and things like that.
My thinking with that is I play what I want. If you want to watch me, whatever. If you want to not watch me, I don't care. And, you know, going back to the whole variety thing, you know, a lot of streamers I've observed, because I went into this as thinking of it as a business, so I had to look at, you know, successful and not successful people. But the not successful people I've observed so far, the people who are trying to go for Twitch partner or trying to raise their average viewership and stuff like that, they tend to jump around quite a bit from game to game, and that I think is a huge contribution to the lack of success that a lot of streamers get. Like, for example, I mean, we can look at one of the most successful streamers in the world right now, Cypher PK. He started out in ESO. He stayed in ESO for at least 2-3 years. He built up his base, and then he moved. He didn't go, okay, I'm going to play ESO 1 week. Oh, I'm going to play Fortnite next week. I'm going to play For Honor the 3rd week. He built it up, and that's the same case with every other streamer I've seen that's really successful. And for example, like XQC, he started where in Overwatch, he built his base up. Cypher, ESO, and there's other like categories people just kind of grew out of. Then they did other things. They didn't go variety first. So yeah, I think that's a solid tactic.
I think you hit the nail on the head. As somebody who does a lot of, like I said, work with analytics and things like that, is you have to have a through line, a base. And what even people who grew purely in variety, if you look at somebody, you know, who's like didn't like only grow in one game, they grew in multiple games, they still had a foundation, because a lot of pure variety streamers who grew in pure variety without splitting from their main game first, their base game is basically the just chatting category. So they still had a through line, because those streamers generally spend a lot of time in just chatting before moving to other games. So even though it's not a game, they still have that through line. I think that's what you brought up as the important thing, is like XQC out is XQC Overwatch, and like Cypher, have to build in a game, have to have a foundation. And like you said, switching too much doesn't allow you to build a foundation. And that's the other thing I wanted to bring up about analytics, is in analytics, we don't ever make judgment calls for my consultation work or for jobs I had in the past on, oh, this didn't work for a few weeks. Everything's on 120-day monitoring. So like, I think just to build on what you said about switching too much, is if I just looked at my podcast when I started doing the podcast, the first like month or even 2 months I was doing it, I'd be like, well, podcast is bad. Got to stop doing this. It's time to switch to something else. Whereas after 120 days, consistent, it happens on this day, it started to be its own thing. And that's the other thing about variety is, people you have to grow a base. And when you put time into a game, you need to be putting time into that community and legitimately being in that community, because you need that length of time to truly grow in anything.
Yeah. Which is why I don't understand why people don't do that. I don't know.
Yeah, it's I see a lot of people switch, or people who grow in one thing and have transitioned other, and people see that people have transitioned. For example, there's like 8BitD, who used to be an ESO streamer, got partnered in ESO, and now is almost purely like more of a retro game streamer. But that didn't just be like, oh, I'm switching overnight. That is, even if you do want to switch base games, there's a transition where you kind of okay, over time, like you have to like, yeah, you can't just pull up stakes, burn all your bridges, toss up the bird and expect people to take a road with you somewhere else.
Right.
Awesome. So just one last kind of thing before we move to Q&A that I always like to ask people when they're on is if somebody was just starting out in streaming, or maybe they're new to streaming, or just, you know, kind of or thinking about it, what's a piece of advice that you'd give? Because I always like to ask everybody who's on the podcast, because everybody has such kind of different advice that is kind of like their maybe go-to piece that they give to somebody when they ask that question.
Like a advice for a new streamer.
Yeah, somebody who's starting out, somebody who's new. So.
I guess the first step would be to make sure you're not just putting all your eggs in one basket. As far as streaming or content creation goes, I think people should be looking at the future or current options, even like YouTube, Twitch, even Facebook gaming. So don't be tied to one specific platform when you start out. And also, oh god, there was another thing I completely forgot it. Just enjoy it. Don't stress too much about it. I think you should also enjoy the work you're doing. You shouldn't just treat it just as work. And I think this is gonna sound messed up. I think it should be funny or good at the game, or have your own niche. You know what I mean? Like, I think it all comes back to entertainment value.
That you have to. I think from a content, you have to have value. That value can be educational. That value can be, I am a top League of Legends player, and my value is people want to see top end play. It can be, like I said, comedy. It can be a mix of all sorts of things. But yeah, there has to be some.
Just need to find something.
Yeah, something that works with you, and that, I guess, the stay true to yourself thing is like the cliche adage, but it's actually true, because if you just try to be somebody else, you end up just being a carbon copy. And that's what I always try to tell people is like, if I just looked at what was successful, I never would have grown, because why would you watch a carbon copy of another streamer when you can just watch that streamer that they're copying? So
I think certainly take elements, but not the entire thing. You know, I was watching, I think I saw you there last night as well, right, Loctavian? I was watching Izzy Winks.
Yeah, I'm a huge supporter of Izzy.
That was my first time watching her stream, and I was blown away because she, here's this streamer I've never watched. I don't even, know her, or ever really heard much of her, but she's like top tier. To me, because that might sound strange, because when people go back to numbers, I have more followers, I have more subs, right? But I think that's all. I think watching her, yes, I was like, that's all worthless. Because I was watching her and I was like, wow, I could learn a lot.
It is
from her.
It is numbers are ultimately like rest in peace Rekful, but something Rekful said was a comment along the lines of basically like, if you get content and complacent in your content, you can do that. If you get to a certain level, and numbers matter for that. If you just want to be complacent and just do what you do and like not grow, but true growth comes from innovation and pushing yourself creatively. And that's why numbers ultimately don't matter. There is so many people sitting at 20 viewers, 5 viewers, whatever, whose content is gold. They just haven't had that. And you mentioned earlier in the podcast, that exposure yet. And that's why I think it's always important, instead of worrying about your numbers and quick growth and trying to get the raids and get people to see you, people should always be focused, like I think Izzy is, on the content. Because if you work on the content, if you work on improving yourself, you look at little things to do better, things that maybe didn't go good that you could splice out, and you just constantly work on making your content better. Then when a raid happens, then, because you can't determine when a raid happens, that's the luck. The moment of exposure is the luck. And if you focused on your content, I feel like that's when people are better able to like seize that opportunity of growth, because a giant raid doesn't always translate to giant growth. It might be a bunch of followers after the raid, but what's going to make them come back is they happen to be there for that first couple minutes. And that first couple minutes, they saw something and go, kind of like you with Izzy, that goes, wow, this is really good content, regardless of viewership at the time.
Yeah, I think if she keeps going the way she's going, she's going to be pretty big. You know? But yeah, things like that. I was impressed.
Yeah, and like I said about the carbon thing that you brought up is like, yeah, take elements. The yoink and twist, a big streamer I like, which will segue into what the last point I want to make, a question I want to talk about, is the yoink and twist is what Ludwig says. It's like, you can't just yoink something, because if you just do that, you'll just be like a carbon copy version. But if you see something somebody does that you think could work, and you can yoink it, and then you can put the twist, whatever your unique thing is, put your own twist on it. That's, you can do content in, we'll just use a random thing from ESO. You can do content in housing. But if you go, oh, these housing contests are cool, so I'm going to apply something different and make your own twist on it, that can make it something that really kind of resonates and pops off with on people. And the other thing I wanted to kind of bring up is you mentioned YouTube. You mentioned, you are also a YouTuber, you make content there. And I think it's important, especially, and that's why I bring up Ludwig, because Ludwig's the recent giant streamer who got courted and moved to YouTube, which is diversification. And I just want to bring that up because I think any content creators creating content with your eggs in one basket, it can go away like that. If it wasn't for Gina, I got demonetized because of hate raids because they false reported me. So I know how instantaneously, if all my finances are coming from Twitch and it just goes away, you have nothing to fall back on. So I think it's important to bring it up. I wanted to hear kind of your thoughts about diversification as somebody who does have the ESOU website. You have like 25,000 or so or more, subscribers who follow you on YouTube. So you make your YouTube content, you stream on Twitch, you have diversified what you do.
Yeah, I think it's really important I did so, just in case like something what you just described happens. You never know, you never know. But at the same time, you kind of know what's going to happen. I feel like, a lot of people are saying, oh, Twitch is failing. I don't think Twitch is failing. That's like I think it's oh, sorry, excuse me. Go ahead.
Twitch has gotten complacent because after Mixer died and nobody got onto Facebook, they basically crowned themselves the winner of the streaming wars. But YouTube has decided, okay, because they're aiming for communities. They're bringing over, instead of just one or two people like Mixer did with like Just Ninja and Shroud, they're trying to bring over people who can bring over community. So like, it'll be interesting the next couple of years. I don't think Twitch is on its deathbed and Twitch is going away. I don't think YouTube's going to be the thing, but I do think it's worth paying attention to, especially as somebody who streams, because Twitch is eventually going to have to adapt and add things once YouTube starts like getting more and more things in place. And YouTube's definitely decided, we have the money to be in the space and we're not going to make mistakes and we're going to try it. So it's an interesting time for sure as a streamer, because YouTube is putting in work.
Yeah, for sure. But I think, like you said, actually, I was going to say it too, and I'm surprised you said it. 2 years, I think, is going to be the time span in which we will see exactly who may be the more clear winner. I don't think Twitch is failing, nor I don't think they're even really complacent. I think they've done the math and they've calculated, and they know, and that there's always somebody willing to take, whether we're talking about Tim the Tatman spot or Ludwig spot or some other streamer spot. I think they're very fully aware of that in terms of promotion and marketing. So yeah, I've been looking at Twitter, and we kind of talk about streaming Twitter again, but people think it's gonna fail or something. I don't know about that one.
90% of people, when they think about streaming, they think about Twitch, and I think, again, like I could have a whole podcast on this subject, so I'll keep it a little brief. But I think Twitch has been making moves to, instead of worrying about, basically Twitch doesn't want to be held up by the 20 top streamers. They're trying to make their platform the such where it'll be easier for them to elevate the next person up the rung. I think they're counting on, yes, losing Ludwig is actually pretty big because he is so interconnected with so many of like the big streaming groups. At the same time, I think they're counting on, well, there's a bunch of people in that Ludwig orbit at like 5,000-6,000 people. One of them may just kind of come up and take that spot, and it won't be as big of a blow. So it's like I said, I think I've worked in the tech field, I consult in the tech field, thinking that this is just like, you're going to wake up on January 1st, 2022, and like scorched earth is going to happen to like Twitch is not realistic. But over the next couple of years, it's going to be interesting to see if there's like how it plays out, and you know, how both of them kind of go back and forth, which could end up being ultimately more beneficial to streamers even on Twitch, because once YouTube gets up and going a little bit more, it like it did with Mixer, probably force Twitch to innovate a little more, which will ultimately benefit people.
Yeah. But regardless, yeah, like you were saying earlier, the diversification, definitely. I mean, it doesn't have to be YouTube, Twitch. It can be things like, what is that, TikTok?
TikTok.
Yeah. Even Twitter can be a source of content creation, funnily enough. So I find that pretty interesting.
Yep. And that's what I think is like diversification. If you're into music, Bandcamps and Spotify, you know, if you have art, like it's just important as a content creator to, you know, at first focusing on one area probably makes things easier, but always be thinking about how you can kind of diversify yourself, because yeah, that way if one revenue stream does cut off, or even if it doesn't cut off, if a year or two later you're looking at YouTube and you're like, it looks like that's the place I want to be. If you've been making YouTube content, that switch will be easier for you if you ever want to do it, things like that. Awesome. Thank you again, Nefas.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, if you don't know Nefas, there's been a link going throughout chat the whole time, but it's twitch.tv/ it's on the screen there, NefasQS. And what's your YouTube and Twitter and all that real quick for people?
Oh, same thing, NefasQS everywhere.
NefasQS for everything?